A dear friend of mine teaches a religion at a Catholic high school in our diocese, and she started off the year with a provocative question for the students, which got me thinking. And it's this: how would the world be different if Jesus never existed? How would the world be different if Jesus never existed? And the students came up with some really great ideas. They said, first of all, Europe would be totally different. The Europe that we know with the structures and countries would probably be in tribes or much smaller countries without Catholicism to unite them or faith to unite them. We can imagine too that without the church adopting the language of Latin, languages as we know it would have changed much more radically early on. So probably all of the modern languages that are from the Western Hemisphere would be totally different. We could also imagine that this would not be the year 2020. We could imagine that democracy would be very different. Since democracy is based on the idea that people are created equal and have equal rights, which comes from our understanding of baptism and as sons and daughters in Christ, democracy might look very different. We could imagine too that maybe the United States wouldn't all be 50 states, or without this idea of manifest destiny, or this idea that we need to continue the good news of the gospel in this country. We could imagine that the world would be totally different, very different. And maybe a different way to ask this question is, what would the world be like if Jesus had never risen from the dead, if there was no resurrection? And this is precisely the question that Paul asks the Corinthians in our first reading today. He's been working all through this letter to get to this point, which is really the biggest issue for the Corinthians, is that there are some who are saying, we're not going to be raised from the dead. And Paul criticizes them and says, if you don't believe you're raised from the dead, you can be raised from the dead, then Jesus wasn't raised from the dead. And if Jesus wasn't raised from the dead, your faith, everything that your faith is built on, is an illusion. And we have not been forgiven. That's a big deal. If Jesus isn't raised, then the whole foundation of our faith goes out the window. The resurrection is the foundation of our faith. And think about all the things that wouldn't exist were our faith not here. We wouldn't have me. You wouldn't have me giving videos to you. We wouldn't have churches. We wouldn't have this cross behind me. None of this artwork. The world would be so different. And there are actually signs of the resurrection around us. We think about this 2,000-year history of the church that gives testament through all the ups and downs of world history of the power of Christ working with us. Christ on our side. Christ seeing us through. We're actually surrounded by all sorts of signs that the resurrection is real, that Christ has been raised. So I invite you to today, take some time to reflect on the resurrection and look for those signs of the resurrection around you, so that we can be reminded that our faith is built on this idea, not only this idea, but this reality that Christ has been raised. And that faith, that belief, makes all the difference in the world.